Hi, this is Dave Steinberg. Welcome to our podcast. Today we're meeting with Todd Ballenger. Todd is my mentor, is someone I've worked with for over 15 years, and he's an expert on personal finance. He's the founder of the National Institute of Financial Education, or NIFE. And Todd, if if you were talking to a young person, a young couple just starting out, and they'd like to buy their home, what's the first advice you
I start with the basics, and that is that it will cost you money to live indoors your entire life. Um, you got to live for free with your parents, but they had to pay to live indoors. Um, and you have two primary forms of paying your mortgage. You either pay your mortgage or you pay your landlord's mortgage. And what I mean by that is if you choose to rent your entire life, you're still paying a mortgage, you're just paying it for someone else. And if you want to live in a house that you own, then you're going to pay your own mortgage. But I want to create basically an understanding that there's going to be some cost to live in a house, right? And that cost is almost always in the form of a payment that's either rent or mortgage, and that's something that they need to think about. From there, it's figuring out, how much of their income currently do they want to devote to housing, and there can be a need and a want, meaning they have more, they can afford more than maybe they need, and then that's one conversation. Or I want to live here in New York, or I want to live in this building. Okay, well then there's a you're going to know what it costs to rent there, or you're going to know if you want to live in this neighborhood what the houses are. You can figure out, what portion of your budget that's going to look like. And you want to be somewhere in that 25 to 35, 40%. That's typical housing costs, right? And then you start looking from there, just the basics, distance, driving, lifestyle, other considerations. But from a financial standpoint, I really want to start off with that foundation of if it's going to cost you money, and then it's a matter of both the wants and the needs, and how do those line up with your goals. And I tend to also encourage people to not to stretch, live a little behind your means initially, especially when you're starting out. If you can afford a $400,000 house, maybe buy a 250 or a 300. Get used to it. Understand the other expenses that are associated with housing that you don't always forget about, and the surprises that could come along the way with an HVAC failing and things like that. That'll happen on a 250 or a $400,000 house. But if you're flying close to the edge of your comfort zone, it's going to be a little more painful. And you can always, trade up, and most people will over time. But I tend to like to have a little more slack on the rope, and I try to encourage younger people, especially to live a little bit behind where they could.
Hmm. It's funny because one of the pieces of advice that I share with my clients is, let's say you're currently paying $2,000 a month in your current home, and now you want to buy a house, and you figure it's going to cost you $4,000 a month. Well, I'd say starting today, start living that $4,000 a month life. Start saving the money today, or taking it out of circulation today, so that if you can tolerate that for 6 months, odds are you can survive the mortgage. If you can't, then we've got a problem, and we've got to rethink this.
That's absolutely fantastic advice, because if they feel stress saving the difference that they're going to be spending, they're going to feel stress in that mortgage payment. So that's a great practical way to get somebody comfortable. If they're paying $1,000 a month in rent and their house payment's going to be 2,000, then start putting $1,000 a month away, for your down payment over the next 12 months, and get used to that $2,000 lifestyle impact, because it will reduce your lifestyle in some ways, right? You may not be able to go out as much. You're going to have to consider things a little bit differently. But if that's important to you, that's a great way to get started. Love it.
So, talking about savings, you've shared your bucket strategy. Would you care to explain how,
Sure.
that works?
Yeah, this is something that had to develop it really for myself, because I had to simplify sort of different things that I had studied and learned about when it came to sort of your day-to-day spending account and your sort of cash or savings bucket for emergencies, which you typically hear about, as the first savings should be for emergencies. And then what do you do after that with investing? So over time, for me, it became a very simple bucket system that I used with accounts. And I have, 3 accounts. So I recommend that someone starting out, I mean, my kids do this, they're in high school and my son's just started college, but they have a checking account, which is that first bucket. And what I ask them to do, and I would ask anyone to say, figure out how much money is coming into that bucket each month from your income that you earn. So if whether it's babysitting and dog sitting or your full-time career, and if it's $7,000 a month or whatever, that first bucket you're setting up is a $7,000 a month bucket, and you're setting it at your income because what you want to understand first off is how are you doing with the quintessential first problem of wealth creation, which is, do you have more money than month or more month than money, right? So if you're earning $7,000 a month and you're spending 8,000, there are no future buckets for you. You've got a problem right now. You've got to stop and say, that means I'm going into arrears, or I'm literally borrowing to fund a lifestyle that I can't afford right now. You've got to stay and solve that first bucket problem. But if the first bucket is 7,000 coming in and you're spending 5, then you get a chance to operate on the second bucket, which is that 2,000 a month can now spill into or flow into the second bucket, which is a savings bucket. And your goal is to have 3 times your first bucket in that bucket. So if the first bucket's 7,000, whatever it is, 2,000. For my kids, it was like $400 a month is what they were making in pet sitting and things like that. So my challenge to them was get $400 in that first bucket and then spill over and get 1,200 in your second bucket, which is a savings account, right? So it might earn a little interest. It's still super liquid and there's different, strategies for that. But ultimately, I want 3 times the first bucket. So a
And
couple
that's your
making
emergency account.
that's emergency, and it's really it's the fulcrum of the system. If you think like a seesaw, the first bucket is your checking and your savings, your day-to-day living bucket, and at the end of each month, any extra money that I have is going to go flowing into that second bucket. But once that second bucket is full, if I have a shortfall in the first bucket, maybe this month we had a medical bill or a car broke down and we had to spend $800, I'm going to pull back $800 from my second bucket to true up this first bucket. Because what I want to do is avoid borrowing. I want to avoid having that ongoing credit card balance that I can't pay off. I'm going to pull back and loan that to myself. And now, once this bucket is full again, it's going to spill back into the second bucket until it's back to that 3 times. So it's a little game I'm playing with the first and second bucket. So what I really have is 4 months of spending. I have my first bucket, which is going up and down during the month. My second bucket, if this is water, think of this as milk, right? It's fluid, but it's not going to be as fluid as the first bucket. And the third bucket's like honey, right? Because that's my investment account. So once I fill up my first bucket with 7,000 and 3 times this is 21,000, I've got 21,000 in my second bucket here. Now, if $1 extra is here, it doesn't flow into this bucket. This bucket's full. It flows into my third bucket, which is my investing long-term bucket. And I say it's like honey. It's like I'm going to pour it back, but it's rare. When I do, it's going to be slow because I need it for something like college funding or something major. But I'm really thinking this bucket is going to sit here for 10, 15, 20, 30 years. But for myself, I would sometimes have too much in the first bucket or way too much in the second, and I wasn't investing enough. And this just gave me a system to say, look, I know that I could live for 4 months on just the cash that I have available. And the average person can find a new job within 2 to 2.5 months. And that's one of the most traumatic shocks to fixed income is cash flow from your job. So if you kind of know that you've got 3 or 4 months of living in these buckets, and if you lost a job, you could empty this out and live for a couple more months. And once you find a new job, I start filling up my first bucket. I start filling up my second. I never had to touch my third bucket. For me to get into my third bucket, it has to be a major expense or a major life event. Otherwise, I'm constantly flowing into this bucket. What is this bucket doing? It's buying long-term growth stocks and investments, not bonds, because I have fixed income from my job. I don't need fixed income. It's just buying long-term growth, equities, ETFs, or whatever, and that's going to compound and grow. On average, it's going to double about every 7 to 10 years. So if I keep putting that money in here and I start soon enough, that bucket's going to get really big. Why is that important? Because at some point I won't want to work for a living. I won't want to have fixed income anymore in the form of a job. And this bucket over here is going to get really, really big. And it's going to get so big that if I stopped working in the first bucket, where does that bucket get filled from? It gets filled each month from my third bucket, my big bucket. So if I got $1 million or $2 million there, Social Security is going to come into that bucket each month. But now I can pour back the difference between what I need from what I get from Social Security and what I need for my lifestyle from that third bucket. So I can take $2,000 or $3,000, and it comes from the third bucket right to the first bucket, and I can use that whenever I need to, and I still have that middle bucket as a buffer for shocks and things like that. But it just gives me a long-term sense and peace of mind that I've got a really simple system that I can explain on a napkin to a young person or to a 70-year-old who doesn't think this way, and immediately have them say, oh, okay, I need $5,000 a month in retirement plus Social Security, which is $3,000, that's $8,000. So it's 8, it's 24, and everything else over here is going to be sitting here growing. And if it's not growth for you, this is where once I retire, I have no fixed income. I want to convert that growth in the third bucket to fixed income, bonds, long-term, things that are going to continue to earn interest. I love REITs. I love, treasuries. It can be, ETFs that are paying, because now that money is providing the income. Ideally, I'd never touch that bucket principal. It's just that 2 or 3 or 5,000 a month is coming from that third bucket income, and that's my income, and it's paying me back for however long I need.
So how does that fit in if you're going to save for a house? How does that system work?
Great question. So that house payment, ideally, you're using the same system: first bucket, second bucket, third bucket. If you needed $10,000 for a down payment, you might very well be able to pull that from your second bucket. If you need $100,000 for your down payment, I already know that's coming from my third bucket, right? Because if I'm making 7, and this is 21, and I need 100,000 for a down payment, then I'm going to keep that system going. This is going to be going into this investment account over here, and that means it's got some market. It's going to go up and down a little bit as the market moves, but it's still a small enough amount that it's not like I'm going to worry I've just lost my down payment, right? Because I'm going to keep putting $1,000 or $2,000 a month, whatever. Boom, boom, boom. It's going to keep bouncing into that third bucket because the first 2 buckets are full. Now there's 100,000 here. I'm going to say, all right, this is important. This is part of my long-term wealth creation strategy, because real estate is one of the best. 84% of Americans have more wealth in their real estate when they retire than they do have in their investment accounts. So this is like an investment allocation where I'm taking $100,000 and buying with leverage a $400,000 or $500,000 asset. And so I look at that as an investment. I'm pulling that from that third bucket. I'm buying my real estate. I'm putting that as a down payment. I'm borrowing $400,000, and with $100,000 down payment and the $400,000 loan, I'm just about in control of $500,000 asset that I'm going to live in. And by the time I retire, it could be worth several $1 million, right? And that several $1 million bucket's my real estate bucket, which sometimes I think of that as the fourth bucket, right, is real estate, because in retirement, I can also borrow against that as a reverse. I can borrow against it. I can sell it and liquidate several $1 million and put that into my third bucket if I want to. It just gives me a lot of flexibility, but ultimately it's just part of my wealth creation.
Now, if you were advising, again, that same young person buying that first house, would you tell them to put in a large down payment, or would you go for a smaller down payment? What philosophically, what's your thought?
Yeah, so it is a great question. And it's a great question because it depends, and it depends a lot on on what's more important to them. If they have a comfort level with a payment, and they really don't want to have a payment beyond a certain amount because it makes them uncomfortable or whatever, your throttle for that's either going to be a smaller house, right, or a larger down payment in terms of borrowing. But assuming that they aren't so concerned with reaching a threshold target for the payment, then I'm going to tend to focus on the smallest down payment that they're comfortable with. because ultimately, the more leverage I have, the higher my actual return is on my investment. Meaning, it's a kind of a complicated financial planning concept. But if I put, say, $50,000 down to buy a $100,000 house, that doesn't affect my growth on that asset. The house is going to go up or down regardless of how much equity I tie up in it. If I put $5,000 down to buy a $100,000 house, right? I've used 1/10 of the down payment, but I'm still getting the same growth on that asset over time.
Mhm.
So, I've been able to leave more money in my third bucket for investing and compounding and growth and liquidity and stuff. So usually, most people's concern with that is mortgage insurance, right? If I don't put down at least 20%, I have MI, and that's where you can always go and say, I'm going to use, strategies, blender funded MI, or home equity, an 80-10-10, or if those kind of products are available to them at that time, they might use other products to accomplish that. But I find if they're not sure, I'll say start with 10% and see if you can live with that. Um, because the other dynamic that people don't realize is if they're saving to get to a down payment threshold, such as 20%, and they're at 10% now, the year or year and a half it might take them to save the 10% could cost them $100,000 in lost appreciation,
Mm.
because in waiting, that house continued to go up in value. Now, also the house could come down in value, could cost them less in the future. But you want to be aware, as you are as a professional, and be able to give them advice to say, we're in a low inventory, price appreciation market where right now you're waiting a year or two could mean a 10% increase in the property value on that $500,000 house. It's going to cost you $50,000 more. So you're trying to save another $20,000 and it's going to cost you 50. So that's not really a great deal for you. If you're in a downward sloping market, then maybe take the time to save a little more and wait a bit, because we think the value is going to keep coming down and you're not going to get hurt saving a little more, because you might even be able to get a better price on the house.
So what, if I'm hearing you correctly, for most people, you're better off buying earlier, getting into that real estate market earlier, rather than putting that bigger payment down, which, which might, and we're seeing it so often today. We're seeing so often where people are just running because they saved $10,000, and now they need more, and then they decide they want to put 20% down on a $500,000 house, and by the time they get 100,000, that's a $600,000 house, and they have to save more, and they're never quite there.
Yeah, it's like a railroad track. It appears that they touch, but you never really get there, right? Because we know that they're always going to be apart, but there's this illusion that I'm going to catch up. And and again, I say it depends, because if they're paying $3,000 a month in rent and they can buy a house today for $2,000 mortgage payment, that's, again, that could be a compensating factor where that would be a really good decision for them. So there's all kinds of little factors that you want to consider, on a case by case basis. That's where the suitability and the eligibility we talk about is really, really important. But for most people, getting into the market, getting started, especially if it's neutral, meaning if they're spending $1,500 a month, $2,000 a month in rent, and they can buy a house for around the same amount, then over time, we know that it's just like the stock market. You've never lost money if you were in the market for 10 or more years. Real estate's like that. You've never lost money in real estate if you've owned the house for more than 10 years. The difference between equities, you don't get to live in equities. You don't get to barbecue with your ETF, right? You don't get to have friends over to sit by the fire with your 401k. So I really do like the fact that the house is it's both an investment, but it really has a major impact on your lifestyle. And going from renting, where I can't even change the wall color or do things that I want to do, to owning has a lot of other benefits that, historically, homeowners make more money. Now, you can torture statistics to do anything, but there's both the fact, well, homeowners have more money and they have higher earning power, but there's also a quality of life component to a stable home life, and a sense of home ownership creates a foundation for success and families. And that's why the government and a lot of the work that was done back in the 60s created these home ownership initiatives to increase our home ownership rate, to a target of 70+%, because it's part of a stable economy, it's part of a stable life. And I do think there are other benefits to home ownership, but there are also really, practical financial benefits to them as well.
Well, Todd, thank you so much. I really appreciate your wisdom. And thank you so much for this. Love to catch up with you again in the future. This is Dave Steinberg. We've been on with Todd Ballenger, founder of the National Institute of Financial Education. And Todd, if anyone wants to find you on the web, where's the best place for them to find you?
Yeah, they can go to NIOFE.org. That's the nonprofit that we're trying to focus on financial wealth literacy and things, but through the perspective of the house. Why? Because it's the largest expense and largest asset for most people. So it's a great place to start. You can also find me out there on Twitter and Facebook. Just search my name.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for having me. Good to see you.